Hello and welcome. My name's Chris Cann with Mining Journal, and with me I have Hayden Locke, who is Chief Executive and President of copper development group Marimaca, focused on the Namesake project in Chile. We've got Hayden for a few interviews to really dig deep on Marimaca, the project and the company, but today we're focused primarily on the risks of execution and delivery. Welcome, Hayden.
Thanks, Chris.
Chile, to start with, the jurisdiction ranks very well. We have an investment risk index as part of our world risk report. Chile is the top rated Latin American jurisdiction. It's a BBB rating in our books. How have you found working there, and what are the key concerns that you have?
Yeah, it's an amazing jurisdiction, frankly. My joke is always maybe my bar was set reasonably low by starting my career in Africa, where things tend to be more challenging than less challenging. But Chile is a very advanced nation. The education system is fantastic. It's got a long history of mining and an understanding of the importance of mining, and so my experience has been really good. There were a lot of headlines when I first started. Obviously, there's been political unrest, I suppose you'd describe it as, and a redrafting of the constitution. But I think what has come out of that process is that Chilean people and the voters in Chile do want a change to a constitution which was under the Pinochet era. They do want change, but they don't want change at any cost. And I think that is a real reflection of the fact that Chile is and will remain the best jurisdiction in Latin America for investment, and it will remain a tier one investment jurisdiction for mining, in my view.
Okay, as you say, I was going to wait a little while to jump into some of that constitutional reform and the politics there, but since you brought it up, Gabriel Boric he was elected on this platform of change and reform. There was a huge amount of, from an industry perspective, very negative rhetoric around taxes, nationalisation, all these things. As you say, the realisation of the importance of mining and what's needed to attract development and production of copper primarily has won the day. But we are coming into the end of an election cycle. I believe it's next year, I think, elections. What's the risk that all this kind of chat around nationalisation will return, and maybe a more moderated version that could potentially actually get through?
Yeah, I think I'm currently reading The World for Sale, which is the story of traders and how they've impacted political tensions around the world, positive and negatively, over history. And I think the nationalisation and desire for a greater proportion of the mineral wealth of your country has never changed and is never going to change. It's always going to be a topic of conversation. So I don't think that will change. When the prices are rising and mining companies are making more money, governments will want a bigger piece of the pie. They don't want to share the downside risk, of course, but I don't think it's unreasonable that the country that you're mining in would share in the economic wealth that's generated. Gabriel Boric came in on a platform, as you say, of change, and none of those changes have really been delivered. It's not necessarily his fault. I think the Constitutional Assembly went ahead. It was in many ways hijacked by an extremist portion of the constituency, and the Chilean people overwhelmingly shot those people down in terms of their ability to try and push through agendas that suited their own ends. So I think it's really positive for Chile, actually, and I think what it's proven is Chile realises what is important to their economy. They do want change. They do want a larger proportion of the pie. The fiscal changes that are going through will give them that. But they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it cut off their nose to spite their face.
Okay.
So we remain pretty confident. I'm not sure that President Boric will be re-elected. His ratings are not amazing. The question is, who are the candidates that will potentially replace him? You never know, obviously, in politics. But Chile, in history, with some exceptions, and certainly the most recent history, has sort of has swung backwards and forwards between a moderate left candidate and a moderate right candidate. And even President Boric, with his more hard left rhetoric, moderated quite significantly when he got into power. And I think that's going to continue in the context of Chile.
Sure. but when you look at other elections, and I think in the Western world in particular, we're kind of in an election cycle now. A lot of the parties are being pushed more to the left and more to the right. It's no longer okay to be moderate. You're not left enough or you're not right enough. That seems to be a trend. We seem to be departing from that, the traditional way that places like Chile and a lot of other places in the world have approached their politics. There must be some risk that we are going to get some more extreme influences in politics. Who are the candidates that might deliver that? What are your concerns there? And what does the kind of downside risk look like on some of that policy?
Yeah, and interestingly, that's correct certainly in Australia, in the US, in the UK, where we've seen a much further widening of the political spectrum between left and right, in terms of I can't support you because you're leaning too far the other way, and the US is the prime example of that. I haven't felt the division and the sort of almost hatred of the opposition parties in Chile as I have in other jurisdictions. So in the most recent elections, Boric was that candidate on the left. There was another candidate on the right who was perceived to be a much harder right candidate, and he still exists in the current political framework, but he's fallen behind his nearest competitor on the right-hand side. So again, I feel like Chile, while there is clearly a two-party system and a left and a right in Chile, it's much less pronounced and much less aggressive than what we're seeing in other economies.
Okay, and going back to some of the traditional risks, if I can call them that we might expect from Latin America, and particularly Chile, and then obviously Peru as well, and we're talking about labour disputes and disruption there. How do you actually get ahead of that and manage that risk, and what's the climate look like locally where you are specifically, but then more generally in Chile at the moment?
Yeah, it is a unionised workforce in Chile, and the unions do offer protection to labour, and I think engaging early and engaging with an open book as to we as the providers of capital and bringing foreign direct investment in Chile need to make a return in order to make the decision to build these mines, and workers who are working, frankly, in a lot of people don't realise mining is a challenging industry to be a worker in. You're spending a lot of time away, potentially a lot of time away from your family on remote sites in arduous working conditions, and workers want to be compensated and protected for those roles that they're doing. So, and I think engaging early and engaging in an open book is the way forward. But I'm sure there will be challenges that we'll face on that side in particular. In terms of Chile, it's no different to any other jurisdiction in my mind in mining, in that environmental, social and permitting aspects are the key risk for new mining projects in terms of their ability to get up and get financed and get into production. And we've seen numerous examples of mines that have not been able to cross that threshold for a variety of reasons. Some of them within companies' controls, some of them completely exogenous. And so in our case, we're focused really a lot on the risk around permitting, environmental, making sure we're building a mine that's not going to negatively impact our stakeholders, and that's all of our stakeholders.
Sure, and there's a bunch of different terms you've thrown in there about people, environment, community, and then obviously permitting. They're all functions of each other. Mm-hmm. That engagement is a key part, actually having the ear of the right stakeholders at a community level, being out in front of it. What does that engagement and that open book, as you described it, look like for Marimaca? When did you start the engagement process, and what have been some of the policies or the programs, for want of a better term, in place to make sure that those relationships are as good as they can be when it comes to asking for permission to dig a big hole?
Yeah, so we've been constantly part of the community since 2016. So Sergio and his geological team, when they're up at site, live in Mejillones, which is our local town, and all of our services that come up to our site come from our local town. At the heart of every decision from a local group of stakeholders who aren't anti-mining is a desire for their life to be improved, obviously. And how are things improved? Well, providing employment, providing the ability for their kids to be educated and to have healthcare and to have all the fundamental things that we take for granted, especially in the less developed areas, which, there are parts of Chile that still are less developed than the capital, Santiago. So a focus on making sure that we're engaging with our stakeholders and developing the mine to the benefit of all of our stakeholders, not just the money that comes in, is an important part of getting that social license to operate. That's nothing new. The mining industry has known about it. We probably haven't been good at communicating what has been done really well in the mining industry over the last 20 years, I think. And so really having those conversations, and I think the second part of it is, and we're about to kick off the final phase of stakeholder engagement and community consultation, which, by the way, for the permit that we're looking for in Chile, it's not required that we do that, but we've taken a view that best practice is that the communities and stakeholders who will be involved in the project should have a say, or at least be able to express their concerns if they have any, and have those heard and, if possible, addressed and or incorporated into the project. That will commence, prior to us submitting our, that's a formal process, will commence prior to submitting our applications. But we've been doing it consistently, meeting with local stakeholders, buying locally, employing locally for the past 10 years. And in fact, I think it's 95% of our workforce is Chilena and Chile based.
Okay. One of the great things about the project from a Marimaca perspective is proximity to Antofagasta and just that connectivity to more services. One of the downsides potentially is the fact that the communities will be less reliant on the project as an employer, as a source of revenue. Is that a risk for you, that the community doesn't need the project, may not want the project?
No, I don't think so, because despite the fact that it's close to Antofagasta and it's close to Mejillones, as we know, commodities are cyclical, and so we do see in the cyclical downturns that people can and will lose their jobs, and that is something that is on people's mind. The second aspect of it is, and this is a really important one, I think, as I was going back to the risks and the challenges of attracting good people, working on a mine site is an arduous thing to do, and people don't realise just how hard it is to be away from your family for extended periods of time. For somebody living in Antofagasta, Marimaca is a relatively close project. It's less than an hour's drive, and so we won't have a camp on site, we won't have anyone living at site, and that is a quite significant item that will attract workforce and attract people to our project. So as long as we are developing the project in a way that doesn't negatively impact the livelihoods of people in Mejillones and Antofagasta, which we don't think we will, then we expect to see strong support for a new industry and a new base of employment, a new form of opportunity for people to improve and enhance their lives.
Okay, we look at mining codes and bureaucracy as part of our risk index. The Chilean regulation, it looks pretty robust, it looks pretty good. Our friends at Mine Hut, the only legal consultancy that actually review mining codes, rate it reasonably strongly. From your experience, is it fairly consistent and pain-free as much as permitting a mining project possibly can be? And sorry, I should say, where do you anticipate you may have a problem?
So one of the things I will say about Chile is it is a remarkably transparent process. Okay. So every communication, during the permitting process of a mine, every communication between the company and the government back to the company is made public. So everybody can access that. You can see why projects were rejected, why they were approved, what areas of concern there were. And that is a quite remarkable thing when you consider it doesn't happen in Australia. There's you may be able to request the information, but it doesn't happen as a matter of course. So as a jurisdiction, I think they have got it right in terms of the transparency aspect of it. There is always the risk, as there is in every jurisdiction, that a permitting of a project becomes something of a political football. And we have seen that recently with projects in Chile that have been, I think, used somewhat politically, but then eventually got their permits. So in general, I'd say it's a pretty good jurisdiction in terms of there is a rule of law that we can follow. It's a very transparent process. We know the engagement is going to be open and transparent. There's not going to be, we need to go behind a closed door and have a discussion here, which is great as a company because it means we're not worried about potential for graft. We're not worried about leakage. We know where we're going to stand and we can engage on that basis. I think the risks for us are the not understanding our project and not knowing what we're going to be taking to the authorities for approval and properly addressing the risks that come with building a big industrial project. And we think we've got that under control. We've spent a huge amount of time preparing for our eventual submissions and analysing all aspects of the project to understand where the risks for the environment and our stakeholders lie. And we think we've got that under control, and that's already been incorporated into the project development plan. So I'm feeling pretty comfortable about it at the moment, but there is always a risk, an unknown risk of what if anything politics will play in the decision-making process. I think one of the good things about Chile is that even if politics were to play a role, which I don't expect it will, but even if it were, in the end, you will get the result that is right if you've done the work in the right way.
I think people would be, investors would be enthused by the idea the process is transparent, that eventually you will get there if you are doing the right things. But the other issue that companies have that are at Marimaca stage when they don't have cash flow is that their lifespan is not infinite and investors are not infinitely patient. A company has a certain amount of capital. If the process for permitting takes too long, that company no longer exists. You're impatient as an executive. What can you do, or how can you manage the expediency of the process?
So there are two permitting tracks that you can follow in Chile. So I think the first thing is to be as prepared as you possibly can be. You don't want to go into this situation underprepared, because the process is you make a submission, this is what we would like to build, and then the government comes back and they identify their areas of concern and they ask questions and they ask you to do more work and they ask you to, okay, well, you haven't thought about this, you haven't. So the less things that they come back with that you haven't thought about already, the less time it's going to take to go through that permitting process. So I think preparation is the key, which is why we've taken a significant amount more time and haven't rushed into this process, because we really wanted to study every aspect of this to understand, okay, what are the things that could trip us up? And as I said in a previous interview, still keeps me up at night that I have missed something, still keeps me up at night that there will be something that trips us up and delays our permit being awarded to us. I don't think it's a question of whether we'll get it or not. I think it's a risk of delay. And that's probably the thing that I'm most worried about as a manager of a junior mining company.
Okay. I wanted to look at infrastructure and then directly the impact on capital costs that might have. We have talked about previously the fact that you have an IOCG deposit. It's different to the porphyry style deposits that we're used to seeing as Chile's main foundation of their copper production. What does that mean in terms of infrastructure? Can you rely on the same infrastructure that the porphyry producers are relying on, or do you have to start from scratch, or is it a mix?
Well, there's two different aspects to the infrastructure. Obviously, there's the infrastructure, the external infrastructure that's required for the mine. So power lines, roads, communications, housing, where do people live, food, consumables, all of that supply chain network. So we'll call that the outside the fence. And then there's the mine itself, which is very mine specific. So just on a mine specific basis, being an SXEW heap leach project is naturally significantly lower capital cost. That's just a function of the amount of steel, the amount of concrete, the size of the footprint, the fact that we don't have to mill. So the difference between crushing and milling is crushing takes you to a certain size and then milling takes you down to a much finer size, which is required to do the flotation in a concentration plant. So remove the mill, remove a significant amount of capex and a significant amount of power demand. So that's the reason it's positive from a mine perspective. And if you look again at the nature of the deposit, we're an open pit mine, okay, that's great because it's relatively cheaper for development than it is for an underground mine, which requires a decline or a shaft or, and all the underground things that go with it. So on a like for like basis, it's going to be cheaper. The one exception to that is the amount of pre-strip you have. If you have a big pre-strip, a lot of dirt on top of your deposit that is not economic and needs to be removed before you can start mining, that can be a significant change in your upfront capital cost. In our case, we have no pre-strip basically, which is an unbelievable advantage to us. So inside the fence, Marimaca will be industry leading. We've got no doubt about it because of all of those things we've talked about. Outside of the fence, which is really the area where you can see the biggest swings, and you see it a lot in Africa with bulk commodity projects where they go, we've got this amazing bulk commodity project, but we've got to build a 600 kilometre rail line at the cost of $650 million to get it to our port, which we've then got to build at the cost of $1 billion, you very quickly start running into astronomical numbers. I've said it on previous interviews with you that Marimaca is a remarkably well located project. So when you look at where we sit, we're 25 kilometres from the coast. We are 25 kilometres from one of the biggest import ports for consumables for the mining industry in Chile, and one of the biggest export ports for concentrate and copper cathode in Chile. There is a large-scale sulfuric acid plant. There are several large power generation companies. There's an explosives plant. There's everything you need to build a mine within 25 kilometres of our mine. The roads are incredible. We get 5G, 4G phone signal on the top of our deposit. Communications is amazing. There are power lines running across the project area that have capacity that we can tap into. Power is not a problem, so we're tapping into a national grid electricity. So I say it regularly, all of the infrastructure required to build this mine are already in place. And the way I think about that is it's effectively a dividend to us as a company. It effectively pays for a significant proportion of our capital cost. So again, we would expect our capital cost, all else being equal, to be significantly lower than a typical mining project because all of these things are already in place that benefit us. And that's certainly what came out of the PEA, and we expect it to be a similar story in the DFS when we deliver it.
Okay, and so what is the CapEx and how does that benchmark against copper projects globally?
So the PEA, which is now out of date, so I say this so that I don't get wrapped over the knuckles, had us at $285 million US dollars pre-production capital cost for a 40,000 tonne a year plant. So 7,000-ish, let's call it, tonne capital intensity. I think the high side we would expect it to be $10,000 a tonne capital intensity. The low side, $8,000 a tonne capital intensity, somewhere in that range. Would be a good expectation, and we will be targeting, we think, something like 50,000 tonnes a year of cathode production for our DFS. So that gives you an idea of the range that we're talking about. It is a step up, but it's a very financeable step up for us as a company, especially when we have Mitsubishi as our partner.
Okay, and how does it look? You have regional opportunities, there's sulfide opportunities, which we will go into in a separate discussion. As the scale of the project increases, what does the scale of the CapEx look like? And obviously markets now are incredibly difficult. Just because something has an increased MPV, if the CapEx goes up materially, it doesn't make it necessarily that much more appealing for certain investors. What's the investor backing look like for a bigger project, and what does that ratio in terms of project versus CapEx increase look like?
So yeah, this is one of the things that big is, having a huge project is great, but if you have a small market cap relative to the equity financing component, then the market's telling you that they don't believe that you can finance it, and you need a major partner, which is why you see majors farming into these larger scale projects when they like the look of them. So we've assumed in our internal analysis that there is no economies of scale in increasing the scale of our production, which is probably incorrect, but it's a conservative way to view this project. So straight line, what happens if you go from 50,000 tonnes to 60,000 tonnes? You add $100 million to your capex at $10,000 a tonne. So we personally, internally, and we've had this discussion, it's an ongoing debate, but we believe 50,000 tonnes a year to start with is the right number for us. It gives us the right length of mine life to deliver the suitable amount of financing duration for our financing partners. It delivers enough bang for our buck to get the market excited about an NPV, but it also delivers a fundable upfront capital cost. So it feels like it's about the right number for a pre-production. If we make new discoveries, shallow oxide, there is always the potential to expand. We're limited by space in terms of our ability to expand, but actually expanding an SX-EW plant is not the most challenging thing to do when and if you make new discoveries. But from a business perspective, I would say we would be looking at any regional discoveries we make more extending our mine life and creating a longer term business than maybe taking us from 50 to 100,000 tonnes a year of cathode production.
We've touched on permitting, and we're talking about CapEx right now, but the two things that you see more often than not derailing a project at this stage would be that permitting issue and then the characteristic blowout in capital costs. When you're building Marimaca or planning to build Marimaca, what's the area of the cost profile that looks like it's the biggest risk for that sinister blowout?
Yeah, so this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, because equipment lists are relatively easy to get. Everybody can go out and get quotes from suppliers, and you'll be in the right ballpark once you get those numbers. So equipment is not the issue. The issue is labour productivity. How many man hours does it take to actually construct the project that you're talking about? That's the one big area. If you go in with an estimate of 1 million man hours and it's 10 million man hours, well, you can very quickly run up a significant cost overrun. The other area that we are very focused on is the civil and earthwork side. And the reason for that is there have been a lot of examples of groups that have made an assumption that the bedrock and the foundations will be of a certain scale. And when they actually get into it, they realise they've got significantly more earthworks that they need to do, and they have significant more structural concrete and steel to use in the construction of the project. So from our perspective, we're focused a lot on the labour productivity and what impact that has in the overall constructability of the project and the civil and earthworks. The benefit we have is we have a Senco who have recently built a project under an EPC contract, who know the labour productivities and have that in real-time data. I mean, they're just about to hand over the keys for one of the biggest new mines in Chile, having built a mine that is very analogous to Marimaca in Peru maybe three years ago. They have a lot of information about this, and we've said to them, we don't want factoring, we want real calculations of labour productivity against what we're actually going to have to deliver to build this. So those are probably the areas where I see the biggest risk. And then, of course, there's the indirects, which tend to be factored off the main thing. But you can counteract that by having potentially a slightly more conservative view on the factoring that you use.
Are you building in a contingency for the DFS, and what's that look like?
So the contingency comes out of a Monte Carlo simulation based on probabilities on all of the different factors that go in. But I would expect it'll be somewhere between 15 and 20%, something like that. That would be an industry norm. Probably not as high as 25, definitely not as low as 10.
Okay, we're not ignoring the ESG and sustainability factor, whether you call that a risk or not. We will dive into that in a separate interview, but for the risk profile of Marimaca, we'll leave it there. Thanks, Hayden.
Thanks.